Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Conduitao podcast with Sovereignty First. We are meeting here with Dr. Eric Wolterstorff to discuss dilemmas related to exclusion from negotiations, agreements, consultations. Welcome, Dr. Eric Wolterstorff, to this talk. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so my name is Melissa Finn. I'm the founder and CEO of Conduitao. And I will be filling in for Steph Gordon today to talk with Eric. Great. So, Eric, on this issue, we have a host of people in the world who have such amazing energy levels, and they seek to create change in the world. They want to create the kinds of solutions that will really solve very, very complicated issues, both at a global level, but working at the local level. These activists are extremely passionate, and they have, in some cases, been working for decades on their issue area. Sometimes in the case, even from childhood. I know many situations like that. In their work, they have encountered a lot of frustration, trying to get the attention of people who would be able to help them to accelerate solutions to their problems, whether it's climate change or environmentalism, whether it's indigenous issues. A lot of activists working for the indigenous community often feel that change is very slow moving. In February, we had a conversation, and we were talking about this, about how activists are trying to do this work, but they feel kind of disillusioned. They're striving and they're working and they want change, and it's not happening for them. I think that it would maybe make a lot of the audience members who are in this position, who are really feeling like something needs to shift for them. I think it would give them a lot of clarity, possibly empower them, possibly give them new ideas. If maybe you could articulate, why is it that on complicated issues, change is so incredibly slow moving?
Sure, great question. Great question. Thanks again for bringing me back to talk about these themes. So our audience today are activists. You could be working outside of an organization. You could be with a nonprofit. You could be with a startup. The point is the reason for your business, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit, is to make some sort of a change, a positive change in the world. Mm-hmm. And as you were talking about, Melissa, many people feel frustrated around this. And the frustration, many activists feel frustrated, is they can feel as if they're excluded and as if change is coming too slowly. Yeah. Am I hearing you?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So the first step is to not exclude people yourself, meaning you can stand outside where there are meetings and say, include me in the meetings, including the meetings, until you're blue in the face, and you may never be included in the meetings. Instead, you can say, I'm going to host these meetings. And now it changes. Now you're the host. So as the host, who you're going to include and not include. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking today about 3 different groups. Actually, that's not true. 4 different groups who it's important to include. One is other activists.
Yes.
That's the first. The second is investors, whether they're philanthropists or whether they are very conservative investors. So we're looking almost purely at profit. So there's a whole range of investors. And then the next is government agencies. And then the last group to include are for-profit businesses who are not focused on this particular issue.
Right.
Okay. So what I want to chat with you about is why each one of these needs to be included, and some of the typical obstacles or reasons that each of these groups isn't included, and then to point you in the direction of how you can include them. We're not going to go into the nuts and bolts and the how during this talk. That's much too detailed, but just a sense of why you should bring these folks in, and some of the things that may be preventing you from doing so. Does that sound okay?
Absolutely. So instead of trying to get into meetings, creating a situation where you're hosting the meeting and creating the conditions to bring certain people to your meeting.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. Okay. So let's start with other activists. Okay. Something that often plagues activists is that they will, and forgive me if I insult anybody listening here. I certainly have fallen prey to this, to what I'm going to describe this problem, and I see it all around me. That may or may not apply to you. I'll see a problem in the world. I want to have that problem solved. The problem's not getting solved quickly enough, so I guess I'm going to need to lead the charge to do it. Fine. So it's my initial motivation is about me, I, how I see the world, how I want the world to change, and I guess I'm going to have to lead. So that's where it always starts. That's necessary. That's wonderful. This is your calling. You're called to do this. So you've got to hear the call. So that's really good. A thing to realize is, though, is you've got other activists, other civil society groups, other entrepreneurs who have also felt the same call or very closely related call. And at the beginning of starting something up or being an activist, there tends to be too little time and too little money. So startups struggle with no time, no money, not enough time, not enough money. And it's easy to see these other activists as competition.
Okay.
And you will find that some will want to play well with you and others won't want to. It's not your job even to really figure that out. The point is, these are the first people to invite to your party. Okay. And the ones who don't play well with others aren't going to come. They're going to see you as a threat to their funding or a threat to their, to their territory or a threat to their righteousness or whatever reason. And that's fine. But you sent them not only an invitation to the first party, you've sent them an invitation to all of your parties. Okay. So they have a standing invitation to come in. You want to work with them. And you may find that when they learn more about you, or when they learn that you've got staying power, or they hear from other people that you're trustworthy, or when you start to get other people to come to your party who they haven't been able to include or be included by, or, heavens, if you actually manage to bring in money, there's all sorts of reasons they're going to want to maybe come to your party later. And then later you're just gracious about it. Good, let's talk. Good, let's talk. Okay? So other activists. Why is it important to include other activists? Well, because they feel a similar call. You couldn't find better allies in the world if they can play well with others. So this is why you start with them, right? So we talked about the objection, which is fear of competition, fear of loss of originality, and so on. Yes. And the way to get over it is you simply invite them, and then you see, do they play well with you? Can you play well with them? Right. So let's pause there for a second. Okay. Including other activists. What do you think?
Great. Now, activists might struggle to overcome the feeling of wanting to protect their turf.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
So would you say in the thing that you're describing, in the process that you're describing, if people hold on to the need to protect their turf, they're actually undermining their capacity to initiate change?
That's right. That's right.
So it's almost like they're unknowingly doing the work that they're doing they're unknowingly kicking themselves in the foot, basically.
Yes. So a question I have is that as we're talking, people are going to be sending us things, right?
Yes.
So how are we going to include that feed? What are we going to do about that?
Well, we'll open the floor after our discussion for people to talk about some situations that they're in and get some feedback from you. So you have said that activists need to include other activists. Who else do activists need to include in the party that they create? So we've been talking about them hosting this event or hosting meetings on a regular basis as much as possible, inviting people. Who else do they have to invite in order to start to get some traction in a space where they have historically not had as much traction as they would have liked?
Sure. Okay. So we'll look next at investors,
Okay.
and then after that, we'll look at government agencies, and then after that, we'll look at other businesses.
Okay.
Okay. But I just want to check on something. Is it, you want to wait until we've done all four? Or do you want to bring in some questions about this right now? I just want to make sure people aren't sitting on feedback right now.
No, we're good. You go ahead. I want to hear from you those other areas that you think really need some clarity.
Okay, good stuff. So investors, there's a range of investors. Some investors at one end want to do good in the world and they're sitting on money. They don't care really whether they get any money back. They're sitting on $500,000. They want to do good in the world. If they can do good in the world and get money back, that's great. But if they felt confident they could do good in the world, they'd spend their $500,000. So these people are philanthropists at this end.
Yes.
And that runs all the way across to people at the other end, who are people who invest money and they want to get the highest amount of return on lending that money out or investing that money with the least amount of risk.
Yes.
So investors run along that spectrum.
Right.
And you can get pure examples of both at both ends, but probably a whole lot of investors you'll talk with are somewhere in the middle.
Yes.
They'll be like, if I put in $500,000, in 5 years, I'd like to have 400,000 of that back. Well, that's generous. They're giving you the use of $500,000 of capital, and not only are they not charging you interest, they're going to give you 100,000 of that. So they're
not risk averse.
Not in the slightest. They're heavily on the philanthropic side. They know that some things you can't solve while getting an upfront return. So that's great. And there's other investors who say, you know what, I could get a 6% return with a moderate risk, but because I believe in what you're doing, I'll lend you the money and through equity or a loan, and maybe I'll get a 3% return, and it's much riskier. But I'm willing to do that because I believe in what you're doing, right? So there's people along this spectrum. And so you've got to find out not only their investment strategy, but their investment strategy depends on the subject. You could say, no, some investors will say, all I care about is the best return on my investment, unless you're talking about educating children. Oh, I'll move as much of my money as I possibly can to help educating children.
Yes.
So right? So when you're talking with investors, why do you need to invite them to the party? Why do you need to listen to them? Because all of us need capital to solve the problems, and you want to find the people who are interested in focusing on this problem.
Fascinating.
Right?
Absolutely. So do you have anything more to say? I have a question for you.
Please.
Two things. How do you figure out how do you identify the two different types, and is it important? And how do you figure out what they're interested in funding?
Both questions have the same answer.
Okay.
You ask them.
Oh.
No, and they'll be happy to tell you. They'll be so happy to say. Some of them tell you up front. Like if you go to the Gates Foundation, for example, and I'm picking this is true for individuals. I'm giving one of the biggest examples in the world, but they'll tell you, we invest in this, this, and this.
Right.
This is what we most care about. You can send us unsolicited stuff on this. I will also solicit things around it. Then we've got, I can't remember, it's like 10% or something, or 5%, that they will do in sort of a friends or families or pet projects sort of a way. Yes. But 90%, I could have the numbers wrong, but they make absolutely clear what they care about and what their investment philosophy is.
Right.
because they don't want to waste your time, and they don't want you to waste theirs. And they're looking for matches. They're looking for, where's a good match? Where's a good partnership for us?
What I find absolutely fascinating about this is that activists tend to drive headlong into addressing the issue. They're focused on being experts in the issue. They're focused on the messaging. They're focusing on, mobilizing the masses. Whereas what you're saying is their research should really be on the stakeholders and their interests, and trying to figure out what the interests are of those stakeholders and bringing them into the room.
That's right. That's right. That's absolutely right. Because more information comes in the room, more resources, more technical resources, more financial and social network, and a ton of other resources come into the room. That's absolutely right. And I guess one last thing to say is, people on the capital side tend to move slower. And they move slower for, not slow like government slow. That's way slow. We're getting there next. They go slower because if someone has money and they invest that money, and they haven't just stuck it away with a broker and they never think about it. But if they actively invest their money, right, that's found out, and they are approached all the time.
Right.
And the more money and the more active and the more thoughtful they are and the more they care about the issue, the more traffic they get.
Right.
Okay. So they have to spend time sorting and sifting and doing layer after layer of due diligence to be responsible. Like, they want to solve the problem just as much as the activist, perhaps. But the activist is going to be moving really fast, like a hummingbird. The entrepreneurs move like hummingbirds. They're so fast.
Right.
And the investors are like, a beehive full of honey. And they're like, maybe you all want it, but who should actually get this? Because they've got a history of investing poorly and watching the money just burn away and do no good. And so they need to look, they're looking for good matches all the time.
So they're looking for people to reach out to them who are in alignment with their values.
Their values, their goals, their objectives, who are competent. They want to invest their money badly.
It's almost like activists could accelerate the work that they do if they just did this research on the investor community and found those investors whose work and interests align with their own, and pursued them and see do they accept unsolicited approaches, and on what areas are they working. They can make things go so much faster for their work.
Yes, and do some initial research and then reach out and invite them. Invite them to meet and say, I have questions. I know, you say upfront, I care about this issue. I care about saving the, orangutans. That's what I care about. I'm an orangutan guy. Okay. That's what I care about. And I know for that to happen, it's really, really complicated.
Yes.
And so I know that I'm going to have to talk and include a lot of people, some who care about forests, some who care about supply chains with wood and palm oil. I know I'm going to have to talk with governments and all these sort of people. And so that's where I'm coming from. It's that I want to help the orangutans. You're connected to that in some way. And I want to learn, what is your connection? What do you care about? What do you want? Who do you investment? What kind of investment? And I want to start a conversation.
Right. Amazing.
That's
awesome.
The reason it's so hard for activists to do this is activists quite often go, the whole thing, the eyes are bigger than their stomach. The activists try to go unreasonably quickly, right? There's the whole thing around the unreasonable society, that wonderful quote, is it George Bernard Shaw or somebody who said, the unreasonable people, the world only changes because of unreasonable people. So activists and entrepreneurs, absolutely be unreasonable, because that's the only way the problems are going to get solved. And the fastest way to get there is not to say, who will pay for my project right now? Oh, you won't? I guess you just don't really care. I guess you don't really get it. And then if you say that to everybody, now you are righteously standing alone.
Yes.
Or you've got 17 friends who believe in you and colleagues and people who believe in you, and 8,000 potential helpers have been excluded by you.
Right. Wow.
Okay?
So you're kicking yourself in the foot.
That's right.
Yep.
Okay. So those with the investors, you want to find out what do they care about? What do they invest in? And so on. Right? And both when you talk to activists and when you talk to investors, a whole bunch of them aren't going to be interested. That's fine. It's no big deal. You just keep inviting. You invite 100, 10 are interested. You invite 100, 5 are interested. Great. Then you start with those 15 people.
Right.
Right. So in other words, the strategy is, instead of trying to solve the problem, it's trying to create an ecosystem of other actors from different sectors who want to solve the problem.
Right. Right. Creating your community, and the community of not just activists and other activists, but other critically important stakeholders who are as invested in the topic as you are and the issue as you are, but who come from a different sector, or they have a slightly different way of looking and addressing the issue. Maybe they don't exactly, speak in the same language that you do, but at the end of the day, they want to help the orangutans. They don't want to see the orangutans go extinct,
right.
And they are willing to, invest resources to address that issue.
That's right. And they not only do they have a range of philosophies. Do I care about risk versus reward, and that's the main thing, or do I simply care about how can I give my money away best in this range? But there's also a range of speed at which they work. Some say we have an 18-month grant cycle.
Right.
That's the cycle. That's the way it is. And there's no point in you arguing with that cycle. That entire cycle may be very wise, prudent, intelligent, and it could just be silly and counterproductive. But that's not your battle. Your
Yes.
battle is saving the orangutans. It's not arguing with somebody's 18-month grant cycle.
Right.
Other people will, if they like you and what you're doing and they agree with the issue and everything, they can do their due diligence and they'll be cutting you a check in 2 to 4 weeks. It depends on, now, and the second thing though is almost always they will start small and then they will increase if it goes well. Because because that makes sense. We do everything in life that way. If someone says, I want you to meet this friend of mine, I think you're really going to like each other. You're not like, great, let's set a date and get married in 3 weeks. You're like, that could be nice. Would you give me their name so I can stalk them on Google? Okay, great. Now maybe a cup of coffee. I mean, there's a set of steps we go through. Right? That's what the investors do. The investors say, who is it who would like some of this, who would like to be supported? And actually, supported's the wrong word. Who would like to be an instrument through which my capital can flow to solve a problem we both want to solve.
Right. They're looking for a conduit.
Right. Exactly. So that's the second group, are investors.
Okay.
Okay. The third group is relevant government agencies.
Okay.
Okay. The government agencies tend to be highly constrained. They're constrained by their mission. They're constrained by budget cycles. And they are built, government bureaucracies are built to move slowly. That is not a bug, that is a feature. Okay. So you may have to get 5 people say yes in a bureaucracy and 1 says no, and the thing is stalled.
Yes.
That's on purpose. So when you deal with with the government agency, you want to find out, is this a core part of your mission? Do you agree with this a little bit? Is this not an issue for you? And then whether it is or isn't, then you're playing a longer game with them. So even if they're enthusiastic in their support, a government agency is enthusiastic unless you're in the middle of an emergency zone and you're dealing with FEMA or something, some sort of emergency management system, they're going to move quite slowly. And you need them because they can bring credibility, they can bring in funding, they can bring in resources, they can bring in all sorts of things, but they're not going to bring them in quickly. So, but it's going to take 2 years before they're going to start helping, even in a small way. Then start that 2 years right now. Because you'll look up and 2 years will have passed. And if you've been developing the relationship to 2 years, then things move forward when they're ready because you prepared. And if you haven't started, then you just got another 2-year delay. Okay.
With government officials, it always seems like there's gatekeeping. Like you have to like start from the bottom rung. Like it's really difficult to, isn't it, to kind of get a connection building with someone who is key in decision making in government agencies? That's
everywhere. That's in businesses, government agencies. That's in large enough nonprofits and large enough even entrepreneurial startups. That is a function of size. That's true with investors. And it's an efficiency thing. It's a vetting and efficiency thing. So you go through the early gatekeepers, and their job is to, if you appear to be a yes or a promising maybe to them, then they move you through. If they're pretty clear that it's not so much right now, then they're a no. Sometimes they make mistakes, but they're filtering. That's their job.
Right. And to connect, do you need to have the big wigs in the government in your party?
Well, yes and no. Sometimes you're going to have someone at a certain level who is the decision maker. But that decision, for example, I was in DC working for 7 years. And when there is when somebody is trying to move a piece of legislation through, you've got the 435 congressmen and congresswomen, you've got the 100 senators, and think about if you've got a really clean, powerful hour-and-a-half presentation, you've got to show up at a meeting, people may be late, there's some social niceties, then you have your 90-minute presentation, there's a little bit of follow-up. So you've got to block 2.5 hours for that, and they may be later than that. So you may have to just block a half day for that 2.5 hours because you may be sitting in an office waiting for an hour, right? So you can do maybe 2 of those a day. They're in session, or at least their staffers are in session a certain amount of time. There's no way you're going to get that amount of time with a congresswoman, congressman, with the senator. That's not going to happen. The whole government would shut down if people get that kind of access. And that's not their job. Their job is to look at a final range of choices and choose among those. It's their staffers, and they'll have a designated staffer who whatever issue you got falls under. And you've got to find out those staffers, you present to those staffers, and you've got to do that 535 times. If you're doing that twice, 2 a day, and you are one 2-person team, that takes a year just to talk to the staffers. And that's the work. You need to get as high as the select staffers. You don't want to waste the time talking to the congressman, congresswoman. It's a complete total waste of your time and theirs. So you're not going to get there. But the final decision they'll make. And that's true. Things are delegated at certain levels in organizations. The organization, if they're interested, will find that level. They'll place you. You have a good pitch. You have a reasonable ask, which is basically to interview, to get questions. And sometimes you can get all the information you need from somebody 6 steps down. I apologize for going a bit into the weeds around that, but not to worry about gatekeepers. It's not as if people are rejecting you and your ideas. You may be rejected and your ideas may be rejected, but the stuff that we're talking about now is not that rejection. This is all before the rejection.
And absolutely very interesting, because the staffers have already built a relationship of trust with those government officials.
Yes.
So if you can build trust with them, you have a line of potential trust with people who would otherwise be out of reach to you.
Yes, that's right.
This is about relationships.
It's about relationships in the sense of, it is about relationships, but it's when the more influence or money or the more resources that a person in their role can allocate, the more that they have to have a network of people who trust people for them, who who vet people for relevance, competence, trustworthiness, and so on, because they can't do that themselves. There's not enough hours in the day. So yes, you want to find out if you want to get to if you want to talk with Jeremy Grantham about Borneo, then getting time with him might be actually quite wasteful, because in the amount of 10 minutes you get with him, he can't assess you for trust. He can't assess your project. He can't, you get those 10 minutes with him, and it's almost impossible to do what needs to be done.
Right.
Okay.
Awesome. So you are saying that this is the third, and that they are slow moving because of the way that governments are slow moving because of the way that the decision making works. Who is the next set of people that should be invited to that party?
So we have activists, then we have investors, then we have government, and then the fourth is businesses. But businesses are really interesting, because in businesses you get the most sustainable agreements are ones that businesses are part of. Because businesses, if you bring them deeply into an agreement, are not doing that. They're not spending somebody else's money. This is not a discretionary giving. This is, they've got a reason why supporting this agreement will help them to survive as a business. And as much as it can be easy for activists to criticize businesses, businesses are focused on sustainability. They're focused on their own sustainability.
Yes.
And they employ sometimes dozens of people, sometimes thousands of people. And they feel responsible for them, for their families, for providing for the customers, for providing for their investors. They've got a whole ecosystem that they have to tend to. And they basically aren't going to spend money discretionarily unless you've got a board member or a CEO who has a child who is autistic, and they say, we are going to give money to autism. But even then, that money tends to fall under the marketing goodwill for the company. So even discretionary giving tends to fall under the marketing budget.
Right.
And people can complain about that, but think about, like the example with the orangutans. There are companies that get their lumber, they get their palm oil, they are somehow, without getting too deep in the weeds, they're tied into the business ecosystem of Borneo.
Right.
And their behavior may have to change. And so for their behavior to change and them to survive as a business, even if they're interested, and they're interested enough to maybe say, we'll send a representative to meet with you and you could interview and talk. If we could find a way where we could keep our business going without destroying the habitat of the orangutans, we're interested. If not, I'm sorry, we're your enemy until you make us. But if you can find a way where we can run our business without hurting them, we are wide open to it.
Right, and this is the biggest relationship or stakeholder management issue. Sorry about the feedback. Between activists and companies, because there's a lot of tension.
Sure.
So activists sometimes exclude companies because they feel that they are kind of against the work that they're doing. But what you're saying is invite them to the party, invite them to the event, invite them to the meeting, and talk to them. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Well, listen to them far more than talk to them. Because your talking consists of, I want to save the orangutans, and it's going to take a whole bunch of dozens and dozens and dozens of businesses and government agencies and investors and activist organizations to do this in concert in ways that will work. And I don't know what those, I'm not Einstein. I can't figure out what that is. I don't think anybody can figure out what that is. But if we all put our heads together and we find out maybe we can mix and match and find, ways to move forward. That's the idea.
This is fascinating to me. I spent years working in the field of terrorism. I think when we see businesses in a caricature kind of way, or we don't have those inroads with them, or we see the work they do as entirely self-interested, and I think maybe dehumanize them a little bit. Would you agree that this can create barriers for activists to be able to engage businesses as human beings? Because at the end of the day, it's all people, right? And at the end of the day, if you can invite businesses to your meetings and bring them onto the negotiating table, you're going to see them as people, and then you can start to look them in the eye, and you can talk to them. Is that what you're saying?
Two different things. One is, yes, that needs to happen. There is no substitute for trust. Trust must be developed. That's right. And we want to look for opportunities to have aligned interests. So, So in Brunei, which is a country on the north side of Borneo, maybe the situation is different for businesses than it is for the Malaysian part or the Indonesian part. And a business may say to you, I can't work with anything you've got going on in Sabah, Sarawak, or in Kalimantan. Sorry, guys. I like you as people, but can't help you. But what's happening in Brunei, we can make things work there. And so then all of a sudden you've got an arrangement, there's more trust, and it works in that place because let's say there's different legal codes or different business opportunities or something like that.
Right.
So businesses are highly reactive. As much as businesses talk about being long-term in the future, their whole specialty is reacting in the moment. That's what they do extremely well, or they die.
Right. It's fascinating to me because I think what you're saying is that activists need to do a little bit more investigative work about how they can create opportunities to discover alignment with other stakeholders. That they need to look for opportunities for alignment.
Yes.
And if they can identify those opportunities for alignment, those are inroads that they can now work on and develop and enhance and expand and build trust connections on. Is that right?
Yes, there's two things, and you keep emphasizing one, I keep emphasizing the other, and both need to be done. So one is, in your role as an activist, you've got to do research, you've got to learn about these different organizations and see possible matches and so on. That must be done. That's right.
Right.
The second thing is at the same time, you have a big dose of humility because you make the assumption, I don't have the best information. I don't know where the best opportunities are. And those are going to happen by bringing people together in conversations from this ecosystem. Right. So you actually have to do both. If you're just a passive convener, likely the convening position, it'll fall flat. The meetings will fall flat. But if you're too righteous and too sure that I've got it all figured out, and I brought you all here for this reason to do these things, then people are going to be like, oh, you're a puppet master. You're delusional. They're going to have no desire to do that. So you've got to have done your homework. So you can you can put up a straw man. You can put up it might look like this or this or this or this, and then get ready to just have it torn down. But when they tear it down, they begin to reveal themselves. They begin to engage with each other, and then better things emerge. So you've got to do your research, and you got to invite people, and then assume that the answers are going to come from this mix of organizations and people, and not from your own insights.
Right. Amazing. So, we have, activists on that they feel frustrated. I wanted to, we're now at 40 minutes. I wanted to open the floor to anyone who is attending, who maybe you're an activist, maybe you're someone who is working with an organization or working on a project, working with the government, whatever the case may be, and you feel a sense of frustration with being excluded. You want to create these opportunities to be the host of these events, but you're not really sure exactly how to create the conditions or the how to set things up in order to make that happen. Or you're frustrated with feeling like you don't know how to change your thinking about excluding certain people that you know deep down that they need to be included. So we're going to open the Q&A for any situations that people may experience. We've found that people are attending these webinars and just wanting to watch, but we're opening the floor for any questions. And I will let you know, Eric, if any pop up from people who want to ask you a specific question from their own situation. So can you elaborate a little bit more about how the activists can, build networks of inclusion beyond? So is it just that they hold these meetings? What other things can they do besides, inviting people to meetings? Like you've said, research the stakeholders. You've said, start conversations with the stakeholders. You've said, rather, you feel excluded from these big meetings, start your own. Is there anything else that activists can do?
Listen, you interview them. You say, I want to understand how you see the world. Mm-hmm. What are how do you see it personally? What are the interests of your organization? Mm-hmm. What are the constraints? What are the possibilities? Who else should I be talking to? And listen. And some people aren't going to want to talk, but a lot of people are going to want to talk a lot.
So I have a question for you about negotiations. I was wondering if you could, because I think that what we're calling the exclusion dilemma, which is both being excluded and excluding other people intentionally and unintentionally. I think it's related potentially to competition, and I'm wondering if you have any comments to make about how the kind of contemporary or the main, the most common negotiation model tends to be a little bit competitive. It tends to exclude people who are unsavory, exclude people who, when there's no ideological alignment. Is the negotiation model that a lot of people follow sort of falling prey to a competitive atmosphere?
Well, let's there's a little bit of problem on the connection on your side, Melissa, but I think I get the question. Think about the current polarization that's happening in the United States. And I apologize to give U.S. examples. I live here, so I see these things more. And part of the problem with the polarization is people tend to talk more with people who agree with them, which makes those conversations far more pleasant. If I agree about the world and the priorities and all sorts of things with the people I talk with, I feel much better in those conversations. But if large parts of the country disagree with my priorities or how I assess a situation, then having comforting conversations with people in my faction is nice if what I want to do is feel good about myself. Mm-hmm. But if I actually want to create agreements that are going to help solve problems that I care about in the world, that requires working with other people. Period. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So I guess the thing that I want to say about this, I'm not so much sure about the negotiation current model. More, there's just a general need to reach out across sectors, across borders, across cultures, and across political factions. Very much.
So what about like the fact that a lot of people in the United Nations, a lot of activists, a lot of people working in government, they already think that they are collaborative. Mm-hmm. They already think that they have a collaborative model. But then the work that they're doing is not gaining the traction, it's moving slowly. How do you sort of talk to people who think they're being collaborative when really they're kind of being exclusionary?
Well, right. So I'll be collaborative with you so long as you basically agree with me, is what that looks like. So there, in the U.S., there's organizations of mediators, and I know some people in some of them, and some of them are really clear about what I'm going to say, but some of them have some confusion about it. And one is to say, my job as a mediator is to have no position, and is to help these two parties to find a way together to communicate. And then they might say, and I may need to do some power balance things to help the flow of information. Not because I have a side, but because I care about the flow of information and I trust in the process. I'm a pure mediator, right? And then there are a lot of mediators who are progressive activists who see mediation as a tool that will, of course, help everyone's consciousness to be raised. Right. And then they will go out and make these changes in the world. And so you get a bit of a bait and switch. I want a mediator, and I just brought in a progressive activist who's pretending to be a mediator, right. And then the whole thing blows up.
Right.
So to step back is the first question is, am I being inclusive? And what is inclusive is of who I need to participate to solve this problem. And that includes some organizations who can help, but it also includes those who can ruin it. So yes, the terrorists, whether we actually mean people who are defined by that definition of terrorism, or if we mean it metaphorically,
yes,
must be included. They certainly must be repeatedly invited, and some of them will participate even if it's not the leadership.
Right.
Yep. So the first thing, if it's not, I just want to say, so the first thing, if what you said quite specifically was, I've got an issue, I feel like I'm being collaborative, I feel like I've got a lot of people cooperating, but we're not getting traction. Why not? The first question to ask is, are we being adequately inclusive in terms of the problem we're trying to solve? Not in terms of what we want or in terms of the solution that we have imagined ahead of time.
Right, right.
It's all problem-centered.
Right, right. But as you said, the people who are going to be successful in managing these stakeholders are not problem solvers per se, but people who are able to convene stakeholders, bring people whose values are aligned with that issue, or whose interests are aligned with that issue, to the negotiating table, to bring them together so that they can start conversations.
Yes.
So Steph's here in the background. She's asking a question. What do you think grass movements might be missing when it comes to gaining traction in the form of creating legislative or concrete change?
Great question. There is an idea. Okay, there's two different things. One, a signal needs to be created. So the ongoing protests, which my understanding is have not slowed down in New York City. The news is tired of covering them, but the protests are continuing. The same way that action is continuing in Hong Kong, though much of the world has gotten bored with what's happening in Hong Kong, but the people in Hong Kong haven't. And the protesters in the streets of New York and in many cities who are concerned with police violence have not stopped protesting. So sometimes the media light shines on you and sometimes it doesn't. But the point of the protest is to raise the signal, to raise the point in conversation. So that needs to be done. And that is often done through dramatic gestures that show up on the radar so people start thinking about them.
Right.
Good. Okay. So now the issue's up. Now people are thinking about them. So now the task becomes to make changes what needs to happen. And a mistake that grassroots organizations can have is, if we only do protest, well, nothing's likely to change, frankly. But if we only do protest and focus on legislation, then we're focusing exactly on this streamline in the legislative process. And we're ignoring all the other people who can what? Wreck the legislative process. So the stakeholders, legislation is a proposed solution. It's not the problem. It's a proposed solution. And inclusion needs to be problem-based, not solution-based, right? So as soon as you fix, this is going to be fixed through legislation, and then you say, who needs to be included for legislation? You've already excluded everyone who's not directly part of the legislative process. So you already, you're standing on a tree branch and you're sawing the branch off of the tree. You're already undercutting your own position. It's a really, really, really good question. And a kind of a side question is, which legislative process? Your local city council, the state, the county, the national government? What legislative process?
So
good question.
So you said, regarding just quickly on that, is appealing to legislative change the only mechanism that activists have to solve their complicated problems? No.
There are other things that can be done. There are other things that must be done. Government can only, national government certainly, but even local government can only solve so many problems. They tend to come in late with very broad, crude solutions. That's what they're built to do. This is not a criticism. This is what they do. Slow, broad, crude, late. They're late to the game. They're essential, but that's what they do. So they'll tend to take something that's already worked over and over and then expand it. So having said that, they're late to the game because activists and civil society, activists, entrepreneurs, and investors will have built out solutions. And they may have, before government's going to consider something, they tend to be late adopters. Where has this been tested? How has this been done? What were the results? So they're going to want to see all that before they throw in behind it. But even when they throw in behind it, it's not going to be sufficient. So you can imagine at the top of a pyramid, you've got the activist and the investors. And they're making little prototypes of things that are running. And some businesses may come into that. Then you've got government will come in with other things, much bigger, broader, cruder things. But there's still the giant level beneath them is the society and the culture. That's beneath and far, far greater than government. And so how do we get societal and cultural change? How are there changes in norms? So one of the things that's happened in the last couple of decades that's been extraordinary in the United States is the change in gay rights. I mean, to the point that many outspoken gay activists are now being criticized for being mainstream because they're not part of the leading edge of the queer movement, which is an astonishing change to have happened in a decade. It's breathtaking. And government did not lead on that. That was social, cultural change over many generations. Certainly intense activism from the late 60s going forward for 50 years. And so that came from the culture, and the government followed and is supporting that.
Absolutely.
Which is why it was so little of a fuss with the government, because things that come up through the culture and the society, they just move through the government. It's not a fuss. Yeah. So you've got the three levels, and the government only does the middle level. They're too slow and too crude for the top level. They don't move quickly, and they can't fundamentally transform a society.
Right. I'm going to put up a question here.
Oh, we got a question here. Young Wo Do.
How might we encourage activists, investors, government officials, and businesses alike to break down silos? What would be an easy step for those to thinking narrowly, thinking too narrowly instead of, what would be an easy step for those used to thinking narrowly instead of systems wide?
Well, I think that thank you very much for that question. I think that there are two main steps that we take. I think the first is we say, this needs to happen. This is essential. You can't solve this by yourself. I don't think we can repeat that message enough. So wouldn't it be nice if anytime somebody looked at a problem, they said, is this kind of a problem we can solve by themselves, or is this one of those big old complex problems? And if it's a big old complex problem, then immediately we say, oh, we're going to have to work, we're going to have to break down silos. And the main silos that I tend to talk about here are sectors and polities, so municipalities or states or countries crossing those borders, and cultures, cultural divides, and factional. So those are the kinds of the four different kind of categories of silos that you hear me talking about a lot here. But you're right, the general point is silos, right? So when people go, it's a complex problem, we've got to go across all the silos, right? That's point one. The second thing that has to happen is that we have to say, there are practical, simple ways to do this that simply require the will and the time and going through the steps. There are just step-by-step ways to do this. They're not rocket science at all. And we, you know this, you ask us to come in and actually create a training for you that just shows step-by-step how to do that, because it can be done step-by-step. So first, it must be done. And secondly, here's a step-by-step protocol, walk through the steps and do it.
Right.
Both need to be done.
Right. Amazing. So
thank you for that question very much.
Thank you. Activists may say to themselves, I just want to focus on the culture. I want to change just that bottom part of the pyramid.
Great.
Why is that maybe not enough?
Oh, that is plenty enough. If you do that, well, the rest of it's going to change. But when you're working with the culture, you have to deal with the culture of the civil society, the culture of the investment community, the culture out of which the government arises, and the culture of business. So that's the big game. If we're talking about arresting various kinds of environmental degradation around the world, then that requires a cultural change. But government is an essential piece of that, but that piece is way bigger than the government can do. Even a totalitarian state, the government cannot do all of that.
Right, because there are other actors that are possibly as powerful as some governments. I mean, we kind of operate with the assumption that governments are the major power brokers, but wouldn't you say that there are other actors in our day and age that wield a considerable amount of power that we need to engage with?
Well, exactly. And so you're sort of talking at the very, very, very big level. Yes, there are governments, but there are also, investors. There's funds. There's huge amounts of people who move capital, organizations that move capital. There are governments, and there are huge businesses. But even if you look at it locally, you've got these same exact sectors happening locally. So you've got to bring them all in. You've got to bring in civil society. You've got to bring in the investment community. You've got to bring in government, and you got to bring in business. You don't bring them all in. You need to bring it. You invite them all repeatedly, and the more essential they are for the success, the more you have to woo them and listen to them and bring them in. But you need a bunch of each. Period.
Right. So we'll open the floor. Are there any questions? We're coming up on our hour, and so we're getting ready to wrap up this session. If there are any more questions, feel free to put them up. Any issues, frustrations that you might be dealing with as an activist, being excluded from the kinds of meetings that you think are the ones that are going to be moving your issue area forward. And if we don't hear any more questions, then I think that that covers a lot of ground for today.
So, Melissa, we've had some follow-up from that fellow who asked all the great questions last week. We've had other people who are in an ongoing conversation. So we really want to invite each of you to kind of join this community of thought as we work on this. You probably have things to contribute to us, and there's other ways we may be helpful to you. So please, Yangdu, thank you so much, Yangdu, for your question. I look forward to an ongoing conversation.
Absolutely. And we have our first course of the Solution Accelerator on creating fully inclusive negotiations, creating fully inclusive stakeholder, bringing inclusion, developing inclusion. How am I saying this? To convene people, training people to convene, to be conveners of stakeholders. How do you figure out who to include, how to include them, what process is involved? That is the training of the first course. Do you want to articulate it a little bit differently, Eric?
No, I think the main thing to say is that it's a simple step-by-step protocol to determine who needs to be included and how, and who needs to be included first of all, and the beginning of how to include them.
Absolutely.
That's it.
Because you can watch the webinar and you can figure out that you need to include activists, you need to include investors, you need to include in businesses, you need to include, what was the fourth group? Businesses, governments, activists, and investors. You need to include all those groups, but the online training, the course, is teaching you in more detail how to do that.
And which ones.
How exactly to go about doing that. Some people may be able to cobble together a strategy, but we're relying on your decades and decades of experience in managing stakeholders to address complicated situations. And the course will teach you the protocols to follow in order to be able to create inclusion among your stakeholder, inclusion on your issue.
Yep.
So thank you to everyone who watched. It was a fascinating discussion. Please tune in next time. We are going to continue this conversation. We want to build a network with people who are interested in managing stakeholders, trying to solve complicated issues in a way that is inclusive and that is effective because it's inclusive. So thank you so much to everyone. Thank you, Eric. And we'll see you next time. Okay, take care.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Great, bye-bye.